The world is an incredibly mysterious place, and my personal feelings are that there are forces at work that we can barely comprehend. And to be honest, I don't know if we need to understand them. I'll tell you why I feel this way and what I know. It was 1965, and I was new at my job, just 25 years old and working for the government in an organization that deals with supernatural and unexplained phenomena. The program was called Project Blue Book. You might have even heard of it. Our job was to investigate reports of UFO sightings to study and scientifically analyze data pertaining to said unidentified objects. But no matter how much we investigated, there were some things that we couldn't explain. Things that we couldn't just write off as, say, a weather balloon or a mistaken identity. So one day, one of my colleagues came to me with a report that he couldn't close. It was multiple sightings of a strange creature in the woods near a small town in Maine. He didn't think it was a big deal, and so he passed the file on to me. Now, one sighting alone wouldn't be enough to raise any eyebrows or elicit a response, but this creature had been seen by multiple people, and some claimed to even have seen it emerge from a small glowing object that descended from the sky. Surprisingly, I was eventually tasked with going to Maine to investigate it all, which is what leads me to this story. Once I got to Maine, I tracked down and talked to the witnesses, and they all described the same thing: a bright light in the sky that seemed to be following them. You could tell just by talking to them that it was genuine, that they were truly terrified, and some were scared for their safety, and it wasn't hard to see why. I tried to reason through an explanation as a natural phenomenon the best I could, saying it was this or that, and giving them the best scientific answer I could, which is what we always did with the witnesses. But something nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than meets the eye. This one really felt different somehow. So, I did some digging. And honestly, what I found will stay with me forever. So I'll just give it to you straight. The government is hiding something. Basically, they know something. Something big. They know about and are covering up an alien presence on our planet. While I was in Maine, I was out walking in the woods near where the sightings had been reported. I was using our detecting equipment and was getting some really strong readings. I was actually quite surprised at this. I followed the equipment, which pulled me nearer and nearer to the strong frequencies it was detecting. I was now about 2 miles from my car, and I can tell you with 100% certainty that I wouldn't have ventured to this area without the equipment, and that's when the equipment started reading frequencies I have never seen before. Of course, I cautiously continued, not knowing what to expect, and that's when my entire idea of the world changed. That's when I saw it. A creature. A small yet humanoid creature, with big black eyes and weird, almost reptilian-looking skin. I knew instantly that I had successfully tracked an alien, and every cell in my body then knew that the sightings I had come there to investigate were real. This creature was crouching next to a rock, and the area next to the rock was basically devoid of much vegetation, and the ground was completely cleared. It was obvious that this was a purposeful clearing out of the brush. I stood there contemplating my next move. I didn't know whether to or how to successfully approach it. I then wondered if I had arrived just before something was about to happen, given its proximity to the cleared area. But before I could make a decision on what to do next, it turned towards me. And then, it did something that I will never forget. It cocked its head and looked intensely at me. Not in a way that felt menacing, but in a way that felt curious. In that moment, I knew that whatever this thing was, it wasn't here to hurt us. It was just curious, like a child. But I also knew that the government would never allow the public to know the truth about this thing. It stared at me for a long time, and I just stood there staring back. It was almost as if we were communicating, but with silence and our eyes. I softened in those moments and didn't feel scared. But before I could act upon my now relaxed feelings, there was a loud humming that lasted only seconds and a quick explosion of light. My eyes blinked, then opened to those floating lights blocking my vision. You know, the kind you get after you look into the sun? I looked around to find the creature, but never did see it again. And now I knew I had a decision to make. Should I report what I really saw, or return and write up a report like I always did? A report stating that the witness sightings were all easily explainable with scientific data. I choose the later. Somehow in those few seconds I had come to feel empathy for that creature and wanted to protect it. It was all clear to me now that the government was trying to track these things down to keep them hushed, keep their existence from the public. So for all of these years I have kept what I saw a secret. I never even told my coworkers what I saw when I got back. All I can hope is that all is well with that curious little creature and that it was able to return to its home. I can't believe I'm telling this story. I was 8 or 9 years old and I was a very quiet kid. I always had my nose in a book. It was a good way for me to escape since my mom was such an emotional abuser. During that time, I was really into mystery stories. My dad was frustrated with me because he wanted me to read biographies and stuff like that. To improve my mind, I liked those too, but I couldn't get enough of the mysteries. I guess I fancied myself an amateur detective after reading so many. I had changed schools a lot since my dad was always searching for one that worked with his quirky views. That year, he had enrolled me at a parochial school. We had to wear uniforms every day. It was pretty rigid, but I liked my teachers, except for Sister Virgilius, our religion teacher. She was ancient and looked about 100 years old. Nothing against old people. I love old people. She wore the full-length traditional black habit with all the accessories that go along with nun life. She looked so mean and was so strict and grouchy, probably for a good reason. Since I was so quiet, it wasn't easy for me to make friends. I did have one friend, though. Her name was Brenda, and we had really bonded over our mutual love of mysteries. The school didn't have a playground, so at recess every day they would take us across the street to play at this park. The teachers were very lenient when we were outside, and we were allowed to roam all over. At one corner of the park was this really old white brick building. Brenda and I were obsessed with this building. All the doors and windows were bricked up, so the whole thing was just a giant white brick structure. But you could see the outlines where the doors and windows had been. Just faint lines. We would spend most of the recess going round and round examining the place. We always hoped we'd be able to find a way in. We got our hopes up for a while when we discovered some stairs down to an old cellar door. That was the only door not bricked in, but it was nailed shut. The only other access was the old mail slot next to where the entrance door had been. You could still push that mail slot and look in. Why would they leave that unbricked? When we looked through there, all we could see was a dark, cavernous room and a bunch of tables. The place really had the feel of an old asylum, but it was completely unmarked. Brenda and I were convinced beyond doubt that something was going on in there, mainly because of the clicking sounds. I mean, it obviously seemed completely abandoned, but if you listened at the mail slot, there were these intermittent clicking sounds. There was no pattern to the sounds, but we heard them regularly. It was too loud to be an insect, but it sounded like it came from something alive. One night in the fall, the school was having an open house. It was a chance for parents to talk to teachers and for students to show off their work. The whole school was buzzing with all those people making their way through, checking out all the classrooms. Brenda grabbed my hand and pulled me over to the refreshment table so we could steal some cookies. We weren't supposed to take anything until all the presentations were done. I had just gotten hold of a cookie bar when an old hand came down on top of mine. I looked up and saw Sister Virgilius glaring down at me. I snatched my hand away and ran down the hall with Brenda, and we burst through the front door and ran across the street to the park. We had never been there at night before. We were standing in the middle of the park, and we looked over at the building. The outlines around the windows and doors were glowing, just hairline cracks of light shaped like windows and doors. It was the most surreal thing ever. We whispered to each other and agreed to quietly approach the building. I can't even believe we went over there. It was like our detective personas kicked in and we weren't even appropriately afraid. As we got closer to the mail slot, we started to hear the clicking sounds. They were much louder than we had ever heard them. We crouched down and slowly pushed the mail slot and looked in. There were several lanterns around on the tables, like the kind you would take camping. Coleman lanterns, I think they are called. There were two unnaturally tall and skinny men standing at one of the tables. They had no clothing and were incredibly pale. The clicking sound seemed to be coming from them. They were crouched around something laying under a sheet on the table. We could not tell at all what was under the sheet, but it seemed to be pretty much the length of the table, adult human size. One of the creatures bent its head down, and the clicking got really loud. Suddenly it made some kind of contact with whatever was on the table, and there was like a sharp intake of air. It reminded me of a Dementor's kiss or something. You know, like in Harry Potter? The thing under the sheet started struggling then, and suddenly we realized we should be very afraid. We looked at each other just horrified, and we ran away from the building as quietly as we could. We ran back into the school and hunkered down by a window, trying to see the building. But it was hidden from our view. Sister Virgilia saw us there and thought we were hiding from her. But she was nothing at all after what we'd seen. I have a story to tell, but it could potentially get me into some trouble, so I'm going to leave out any clearly identifying details in the hopes it stays anonymous enough there won't be any blowback. What I will say is this. Many years ago, I worked as a detective for the state police in a state where there are several Native American reservations. Often, we would get called to assist the reservation police on cases that were too complicated for them to solve with their limited resources. As with most things on the reservation, their police forces are often underfunded and with limited staff. This particular case was what appeared to be a homicide. A guy from the reservation, one that none of the neighbors particularly liked, might I add, was found evidently beaten to death out in the middle of an otherwise empty field. He was wearing sweats and a t-shirt, no shoes, and looked like he'd been pulled right off the couch except for the fact that the bottoms of his feet were so worn out. He'd been running for a long time before whatever happened out there happened. That wasn't the only strange thing about this case, though. It had rained earlier in the day, and we were able to find his footprints in the mud several places leading from his house to the open area where his body was found. The back door of his house was wide open when we got there, and his barefooted tracks were in the mud right from the start. He hadn't been pulled off the couch. He was chased off the couch. Only there was only one human set of footprints. I repeat, only one human set of tracks. At several points along the way, we also found what appeared to be large deer tracks running alongside his. When I say large deer tracks, I don't mean large like an elk. I mean large like a human-sized foot, but hooved like a deer. These tracks were also in his front yard, though, in fact, right by the living room window, which had been shattered from the outside. The general consensus among most of the investigators was that someone had come to settle a score with him, and since it was close to Halloween, the assumption was that they'd been wearing some kind of costume to freak him out. It was his brother who told me there was another explanation, but once you hear it, you'll understand why I never bothered to present it to my coworkers as a possibility. It's absolutely crazy sounding, but my personal belief is that it's true. You see, this guy had been poaching for as long as he'd been old enough to hold a gun. He didn't have a whole lot of respect for wildlife or game laws and used some pretty unethical hunting practices, like baiting and spotlighting deer while out on his hunts. He'd told his brother that one night he was out trying to bait a buck in when he came face to face with a wendigo, but somehow managed to escape. The problem with escaping a wendigo, though, is that according to the folklore, you never really do. Once a wendigo has set its sights on you, it doesn't give up. This guy had about made himself crazy over the last few months, telling his brother about how this wendigo was following him around. He'd quit his job over it when the thing kept showing up at work. He'd even stopped leaving the house for the most part and had been pretty close to hermit status at the time he was killed. The brothers' thoughts were that the Wendigo got tired of waiting for the guy to come back out of his house and took matters into its own hands, breaking out the front windows and running the guy out the back door. I know what you're thinking. The guy was a kook afraid of a Wendigo, so why wouldn't someone dressed as a Wendigo come around trying to prank him? The proof for me is in what was found in the broken glass of that broken window. Not only was there blood and short deer hairs all caught up in the glass, but at one place in the shattered remains of the glass, there was a thin strip of satin, the exact kind you'd pull of a deer's antlers. The story took place when I was about 16. It was 2009 in South Carolina, early in the morning before the sun came up. Every morning I would take our dog out to his run before I left for school so he could have some outside time. My mom was home that day, so she would be able to watch him while he was out there. I noticed while on the way out to the run, I saw over the trees to my left a set of 3 lights spaced out evenly that I've never seen before in that direction. We lived in a very rural area, so there were no big buildings, no water towers in that direction, nothing other than woods. I had lived there for years, so I really know what's in the area. I noticed since the lights weren't far away, I tried to listen for a sound as to try to debunk or figure out what those 3 lights were. Being down in South Carolina, we do have a lot of naval and air bases in the area, so I tried to see if it was some type of plane. Even though the planes I've seen have never had those type of lights, and I've been to air shows, and I've never seen lights spaced out quite like this. I should also mention that the lights did periodically turn off and come back on in order from left to right. I stood there quietly for about 3 minutes, staring at these lights, noticing that there's no sound. They don't move in any direction, and the sequence of the lights turning on and back off and then back on repeatedly from left to right really threw me off. These lights weren't terribly far away, but they weren't very close either. I eventually had to take the dog to the runner so I could catch my bus in time, so the runner was about 25 feet away from the spot I was standing in. From the runner, I could not see the area of where the lights were. So I made sure to clip him quickly and run back to the spot, so I'd have a chance to watch it for another moment before my bus came. It was a very short span of time, I'd say about 30 seconds. By the time I rushed back to the spot, the lights were gone. With the lights I've seen from other people's encounters and pictures, I can definitely say that this was a UFO spacecraft, and also the first that I've seen. I never saw those lights in that area again. I did mention it to my mother since she and I always believed in the things that weren't believed by many others. She never mentioned that she saw anything like that, but at least if she ever saw them, she would know that she's not the only one. Looking back now, even though it was early morning, I heard no birds or wildlife in the area. My dog was noticing my behavior, but I feel he also sensed something was not quite right. I used to be a railway maintenance worker. I'm now retired but have a ton of stories from those days. Some are pretty dark and sad, like bodies being found on the tracks, both human and animal. But generally, servicing the rails was a steady and decent job. Not too overtaxing in terms of physical labor back when I could still lift a decent amount and had good cardio. These days, retirement has given me a bit of a belly, but I'm enjoying myself. The dogmen aren't uncommon creatures for railroad maintenance workers to see, especially out in remote areas. Some stretches of track go through the middle of nowhere, big forests for miles, or just fields once you get further out west. In fact, if you're on the right crew, there's a good chance everyone will end up telling stories one night around a beer or two of what they've seen or experienced. Most of the stories are unbelievable to the point of being funny, but every once in a while I'd hear one that would give me the chills. This happened when I was living in Nashville, Tennessee, and got sent out with a crew to work on a track running south. We started out early in the morning and got our gear on, mostly reflective jackets, boots, tool belts. The crew takes out a string of machines that can do everything we need out there: relaying track, taking out or putting in new ties, leveling. It's loud, dirty, and dangerous work, so everyone needs to be focused on the job. But every once in a while, if there's a lull, like if we're moving from one section to the next, you can take a good look around. The afternoon this happened, I was on a crew of about 10 guys, and we were just finishing up leveling a section that had gotten washed out by heavy rain. There were a few new guys on the crew, and one was in his early 20s. His name was Anthony. He was up ahead of me on the track, securing the new ties, when all of a sudden he shouted, "The machinery is extremely loud, so it's hard to hear," but I saw him jump up on the car out of the corner of my eye and looked up. He was pointing out into the woods. This was an area near a river, so we had a decent view down to the water and then across, where a pump house was stationed on the other side. Not sure if it was active or not. I and another service worker followed to where he was pointing and saw what initially looked like a stray dog sniffing around the building. But it quickly became obvious that this wasn't someone's dog. Even from across the river, we could tell it was huge. It stood up on hind legs, bipedal, and moved a little awkwardly around the side of the building. We could now see it better than Anthony could. He had scrambled over to where we were on the tracks and asked what the hell it was. The other guy with us told him, "That's a dog, man." Anthony looked both scared and like he didn't believe us. The three of us watched the dog man, which didn't seem bothered by the loud sounds coming from our side of the river, as it checked out the pump house. I'm not sure what it was looking for, but every few seconds it would get back down on all fours and seem to be sniffing around the edge. From what I could tell, it was a sort of gray-brown with a longer snout that reminded me of a German shepherd we had growing up. When it stood again, we could see that it was hunched over a bit, as if it wasn't used to standing upright. But it moved around easily enough, and when it reached for the single window on the pump house, there were hands where there should have been paws. We could see the fingers as it made a fist and knocked on the glass, as if trying to see if someone was in there. If there was, I don't blame them for not coming out, but it was probably empty. Most pump houses these days are set to operate on their own with regular check-ins by maintenance workers. Anthony was still freaked out and sticking pretty close to us. We had about another minute or two of watching the dog man, and the guy with us muttered that he had to be close to 7 or 8 feet tall. If the creature had been standing next to our machines, it would have had no problem reaching the roof of the lead car. Someone up ahead called that the section we were working on was all clear, and the lead car started up again with a groan, and what can sound like a car backfiring. That caught the dogman's attention. We'd climbed back up on the car that would pull us to the next section, but could still see the dogman as we were moving slow at first. When the bang sounded, he turned quickly toward the river and seemed caught off guard. He must have seen the movement of the machines and the crew through the trees, but didn't make a move to run or try to hide. For the rest of that day and afternoon, Anthony was in a bit of a daze. That night, we stayed in a small town that had a decent pub where a bunch of us went to grab a drink. We went around talking about other dogman sightings, either things we'd seen or that we'd heard other workers seeing on the tracks. I think our goal was to reassure Anthony that the dogmen aren't necessarily out to hurt you. I've only ever heard of them causing trouble, and the one we saw that day seemed to be looking for someone to scare. But he wasn't convinced, and he didn't last too long after that. I think he moved on to a desk job. When I was young, I lived in Salem, Massachusetts for a little while. I don't know if you know anything about that area, but it's definitely associated with a lot of strange history. We lived near the Chestnut Street district, which has some of the oldest houses in the country. We didn't have one of those fancy mansions like in the actual district. Our house had quite a few rooms, but it really needed some attention. I really loved that house, though it had a tall staircase with the best banister to slide down. And it had these cool French double doors with a lot of square panes of glass. There was a claw foot tub in the upstairs bathroom. I was 5 or 6 years old, and I was really happy there, but for some reason I did not feel comfortable in my room at night. I'd be trying to fall asleep, and I would seem to sense someone circling around my bed. Usually when I opened my eyes, I wouldn't see anything. But a couple times I thought I saw a woman sitting at the bottom of my bed holding a child. She just sat there staring at the child in her lap. It didn't seem very old, maybe 3 or 4. It seemed to have dark splotches on its arms and legs. It looked like it was wearing a bonnet, but the apparition or whatever it was seemed really faint. Just shadow, and it seemed to come in and out of focus. And like I said, it only happened a couple times. But the feeling of discomfort I had was often there. I would feel too warm and want to kick off my blankets. But I was too afraid to uncover myself. I would call out for my mom and dad. They would come up to see what was wrong, but I seemed to know they wouldn't believe me if I told them. So, I always complained that something hurt. Then one of them would usually stay with me until I fell asleep. My brother slept in a bed next to me in the same room. He never seemed to notice anything, but he was a lot younger. I spent most of my time outside. My mom didn't like any of the neighborhood kids to come in the house. She was really fussy about anybody making a mess, and she really didn't want to have to provide any of them with snacks or drinks. They would come fetch me to play by standing at the front window with their faces pressed against the glass. When I noticed them, I would go out to play. They knew better than to knock on the door or ring the doorbell. She really didn't care much for children. I was allowed to roam all up and down the block. I was even allowed to go to the candy store on the corner. Well, to me it was a candy store, but I bet it was a store for all kinds of things. I would choose my candy, and then if I had enough money left over, I would buy a pinwheel. I loved those things for some reason. I would blow on it to make it spin all the way home, and then I would plant it round the rose garden in the backyard. I had gotten quite a collection of them. The rose garden was one of my favorite things about that old house. It was planted in a circular brick border and had the old-fashioned kinds of roses, the ones that smell so sweet. My friends and I would crush the petals and make perfume out of them. There were 4 or 5 kids in the neighborhood that I was good friends with. When the weather was warm, we would walk to kindergarten together in the morning. We were in the same class, so we were usually on the same page as to the games we liked to play and the songs we liked to sing. One afternoon, we were in my backyard together. That morning at school, we had been playing Ring Around the Rosies. My rose garden seemed to remind us of the song, so we joined hands and started to circle around. Ring around the rosies, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. We went round a few times and fell down laughing. About the 3rd time, as we were all getting up, something really weird happened. All of the pinwheels around the roses started spinning and whirring so fast. There wasn't any wind. It was hot and sunny. We stared at the pinwheels, and honestly, it felt really creepy. We stopped the game then, and everybody just kind of wandered off home. I went inside and went to the living room to find something to do. I had just sat down on the floor when I noticed someone at the front window with their face against the glass. I thought that was weird since we had just left each other. I stood up to see who it was, and it was the child from my room, the one with the bonnet and the splotches on its skin. I ran out of there fast. My mother didn't know what I was talking about, especially as the child was gone when we went back. But I was the most scared I had ever been. As an adult, I researched the history of that house. I discovered that one of the original inhabitants was a woman who had fled England to escape the bubonic plague. Her child had died from it. I also discovered that the roses rhyme came from the plague that affected London in the year 1665. The rhyme seems innocent but has a dark meaning. The roses stand for deadly rashes. The posies were supposed to prevent the illness. The tissues imitated sneezing symptoms. And the implication of everyone falling down is, well, death.